Hi, welcome to the channel. Today we're going to build a pair of beautiful walnut end tables. I got this job because my client ordered some end tables online and they weren't what they were expecting. They were pretty poorly made with badly sanded corners, exposed staples in the back, and badly painted pine. But they did look pretty good online. Like, I might buy that. When planning this build, we decided to change the style, but keep the original size. I dug through my stack of 8/4 walnut to find a piece that would potentially make a nice tabletop. The idea was to cut down these 8/4 pieces of walnut, run them through the bandsaw, and create an elegant tabletop by book matching the sides together. I like to cut thick boards like this using many light passes. Sometimes there's tension built up inside the board, and if it binds your saw up, it's pretty alarming. At this point, everything we see here looks really good. We're going to clean up one face on the jointer. That allows us to use that smooth face against the fence of the bandsaw when we're resawing. I like to joint with the cup side down. I find it takes fewer passes to get to a staple board. I'm not cutting very deep on these passes, but I think it was like 7 or 8 passes over the jointer before this side was completely smooth. And again, that looks pretty good. Nothing that can't be fixed up with a tiny bit of epoxy or brown CA glue. Here's an action shot of splitting this giant board in half on the bandsaw. So here's where things got interesting. We split the board, and now we can open it up and take a look at that book match. And lo and behold, it is ugly inside. Look at that. It's a bunch of bark inclusions. From the outside, there was no hint that these were going to be there, and they're pretty bad. At this point, I realized I was going shopping for premium walnut. So I got in the truck and went to a local supplier who happens to have thousands of board feet of walnut, and I found these 2 beautiful pieces buried deep in that pile. I brought them back to the shop, and look at that thing. 18 inches wide, 7 feet long, flat, and basically devoid of knots. The price was also double per board foot what I'd normally pay at my wholesaler. But my wholesaler doesn't have this. Even if you cut the sapwood away, there's still 16 inches of clear wood left over. I started by marking out which pieces I wanted to use for the tabletops, which pieces I wanted to use for the sides, and marked out any errors so I could just exclude them. I couldn't cut these on my miter saw, so I had to use a track saw. I put some stickers underneath so I wouldn't cut into my workbench and cut them right at the miter station. All these pieces were going to need jointing and planing. The problem is my jointer and planer will only do 16 inches, so I was going to have to narrow them down. To do that, I'd have to joint one edge so I could pass it through the table saw and use the fence properly. By properly, I mean using the jointed side against the fence so the other side is perfectly parallel. Walnut has a beautiful smell when you're milling it. I find it smells like wood, coffee, and chocolate. We're going to cut these tabletops down to 15 5/8. We're using the flat edge against the fence, and we're cutting the sapwood off because when we finish it, the sapwood will be a solid honey color, and we're looking for that chocolatey brown stripy look that walnut is famous for. After these are narrow enough for my equipment, we'll joint one side flat and plane them to a uniform thickness. I'd never pushed anything this wide through the jointer. I wasn't sure how this was going to go, but I figured making the top really slippery would probably help. This WD-40 dry lube is really good. Like I said, I was a little apprehensive to push something this wide through. I wasn't sure if it would kick back, what the resistance would be like. Would anything strange or unexpected happen? But no, it went through just like any other piece of wood. I'm taking thin slices here and enjoying the process. I'm also using push blocks. I don't typically use push blocks on the jointer, but I figured if anything strange happened, my hands would be further away from the action, and that probably wouldn't be a bad thing. Now that all our pieces are nicely jointed, we're going to pass them through the planer. We'll start our cut at somewhere just under 1 inch. We'll pass the boards through, raise the deck a few hundredths, flip the board, pass it through again, and keep going till we get to about 7/8 thickness. After a few trips through the machine, the board's already starting to look beautiful. As long as one side is perfect, a low spot like that can go on the bottom side of the table. It's amazing how nice that walnut looks after a bit of planing. It's also interesting to see that giant slab of walnut broken down into a small stack of components on my assembly table. The last milling step is to square the ends. I'm using the crosscut on the table saw because it makes quick work of this. I really like the SawStop slider. It's pretty good. I do check it with a carpenter square to make sure it stays square if you bump it badly, or if you have to take it off so you can crosscut plywood, you'll have to resquare it after. And it does get in the way when you're cutting larger things, which means I have to take it off more than I'd prefer. Okay, let's put some rounded corners on these tabletops. I'm going to use these little jigs I got off Amazon. I've never used them before. I've looked at them, I've thought of using them, but I haven't, so excuse the gloves. I smash my knuckles often enough, and I figured if one of these went flying, the gloves might make that less painful. Fortunately, these worked really well. I hardly had to hold them. They cut beautiful radiuses. These came as a set of 3 or 4, and each side of the jig cuts a different radius. They're in metric, but that's not really an issue. For these corners, I'm using the 15mm radius, which is basically 5/8 of an inch. These look really good, but those edges are a little thick, so I think we're going to put a chamfer or undercut on the bottom edge of the tabletop. I cut the radius using a wide side flush trim bit. This particular bit has up and down cutters, so you don't get tear out on either side of your workpiece. I almost exclusively use wide side bits. They're really good and they last a long time. Here is a wide side 45-degree chamfer bit. I cut the chamfer in 2 passes. First was a shallow cut, then I raised the bit a little bit and did a deeper cut. I just slide the tabletops along the fence, rotate, do the next side, till I'm done. Now, I really like the super square edges on the top of this, but these tables will be in a location that's fairly high traffic and has little kids. So I used the flush trim router to put a 1/8 roundover on the tabletops. There are other benefits to the roundover. You're less likely to get a ding on a roundover than you will on a sharp corner, and if anybody were to ever snag some end grain, you're less likely to get any tear out on a roundover than you would on a sharp corner. Plus, it's pretty subtle and kind of fits the mid-century aesthetic. I think these tops look pretty elegant, rounded and beveled. Some of the side pieces were really quilted and brittle, and during the kiln drying process, small fractures can occur, so I'm just stabilizing and filling those with dark CA glue. It's time to make some legs. The legs on this table are a very delicate double taper design. The top of the leg is square at the table skirt, and the cross section is about 1 3/4 inch. At the bottom of the leg, we get down to about 7/8. The double taper will run down the back side of the leg. At the beginning of the video, I cut a chunk off a board of walnut to try making a book match tabletop. We're going to try that same wood again, a little further down that board, to see if we can cut some good table legs. I jointed this leg blank, and now we're going to plane it. We're just going to plane it close to final thickness, but we're going to stay about 1/8 over. It's pretty amazing to watch the amount of material that gets sucked up by the dust collector. It fills up pretty quick. We're going to use the bandsaw to cut the legs out of this blank. We need to make one side flat. That flat side can be registered against the fence of the bandsaw so we can get accurate cuts. I set the fence about 1 7/8 inch away from the blade. Our final thickness on these legs will be 1 3/4 inches. This gives a little room for milling after the legs are cut. This part's pretty fun. Take the leg, pass it through the planer, rotate it, pass it through again, close up the gap a little bit, and repeat. After a few passes, we'll have smooth, square, 1.75 inch thick legs. And this is how they turned out. They look pretty good. There are a few voids. We might be able to cut them out because we can place them at the back side of the tapered legs. If we can't, we can probably fill them with a bit of CA or epoxy. Note that big nick in the corner. We'll get back to that in a bit. The next step was just to cut them down to length. I used the slider on the SawStop because I can get perfectly square cuts with it. We're going to use glue, screws, and scraps to create a quick double taper jig for use on the table saw. With the exception of the hold down clamps, this jig will only be used for this project, and we need to use it 8 times. Well, 16 times if you include rotating the legs. Put some marks on the long board below. These are to ensure that we don't cut into the skirt area of the leg. We want our tapers on the back side of the leg, and we want them below the table skirt. I picked up these Bessey toggle clamps from Lee Valley. They're really adjustable and they can be reused. I'm just screwing them down with wood screws here. Well, actually, those might be drywall screws. Either way, they were just the right length. Now we can cut the tapers. Pass it through the saw, unclamp it, flip it, reclamp it, and pass it through again, and you have a double taper. Before cutting these, I marked the ugly sides, so we could try cutting those off and see if we could eliminate some of those voids that were in the wood. Look at that mountain of dust. With the blade that high, even with dust collection, you're going to end up with a whole pile of dust. We're going to fill the voids with Polymer P-Tech 8400. I'm just going to squeeze out the two parts of the epoxy, and that really does look like something a goose left behind. This product was recommended by a local supplier, and I have to say it works really well. It's dry and ready to sand in 15 to 20 minutes. I'm squishing the product into these voids with a popsicle stick. After I've got the product where I need it, I'll come back and smooth it out. That's already looking really good. But after just a little bit of sanding, they look great. This product sands easily. These legs have a small roundover on the leading edge, and on the trailing edge, or the back side of the taper, there's a large roundover. The large roundover creates a back cut, and that reduces the volume of the leg where it makes contact with the floor, giving the leg a more delicate appearance. You can see the shape of the foot here. It's a little bit rounded on the leading edge, but the back edge has the taper enhanced by adding that large roundover. This table's getting assembled with dominoes, so I'm using a spacer block to mark where the domino should be. One of the legs had a nasty spot, so I chiseled it out and spliced in a Dutchman. After the glue dried, I passed it through the table saw, filled it, sanded it, and it looks good. The legs and skirts will be attached with dominoes, so we'll use the Domino XL to put our domino mortises in. Each leg gets mortised on two faces. I drew a black line on each of those faces so I wouldn't get turned around and accidentally mortise the wrong side. At this stage, we finally get to start gluing this thing together. I start by buttering up those dominoes, slide them into their domino mortises, and then start clamping things together. The third clamp, the one closest to me, doesn't get tightened. I'm just using it for reference to make sure the legs are parallel. And here they are drying on the jointer table. Look at that quilting. It's beautiful. Some of you may have noticed that the side skirts are using vertical grain. Vertical grain's prone to splitting. We can reinforce them by laminating them with 3/4 inch baltic birch. I'm using Titebond 3 here. We're going to apply an even layer and then clamp our piece of baltic birch in place. With the walnut side skirt laminated to this piece of baltic birch, it should never move and it should never crack. Way back at the beginning of this video, we actually bought 2 pieces of wood at the wood supplier. This piece of walnut had long straight grain and will be used for the long sides of the table skirt. The front side of the table has a continuous grain drawer, and that drawer actually is narrower than the side skirt. There's a small continuous grain revealed to the left and to the right of the drawer. The To make all this work, I needed a piece of walnut that was basically devoid of any flaws, and this piece is pretty close. A quick trip through the jointer and the planer to get these to their final thickness, and we can start assembly. The front and back skirt are also going to be attached with domino joinery. Before we can move to the front of the cabinet and the drawer, we need to glue up the back and get it into clamps. We'll use a Bessey squeeze clamp to squish this together. Then we'll break out the Woodpecker CSP clamps to make sure it's square. This wouldn't be a YouTube video without them. The front of each table has a drawer box, which makes it a wide, unsupported space. So I've created some walnut stretchers from some leftover walnut plywood. I even gave them a little edge banding so they'd be pretty. We're screwing that towards the front of the cabinet. We're screwing this into the Baltic birch ply that we use to reinforce the side skirts. For the drawer, we're going to be using Blum soft close undermount drawer slides, and they need something to screw into on the sides of the drawer opening. So I created these little plywood standoffs. I milled some hard maple down to 5/8 thickness. We're using the cross cut to break this down into drawer panels. I have a piece of plywood clamped to the slider fence so that I can do zero clearance cuts without any blowout. Okay, that's what it looks like assembled. I've clamped the drawer face to the drawer box so that I could get it all aligned before I screw them together. You can see from up top here that it is indeed a very small drawer. Like remote controls and glass is small. With the bottom part of the table all sanded, we can start applying our finish. The client wanted this table to be particularly dark to match other furniture they have, so we're finishing the table with Danish Oil in a dark walnut color. I wasn't sure how staining walnut a darker color would look, but it looks great. You might even say it looks regal. I like how the Danish Oil is bringing out that quilted pattern. Okay, that's it with its first coat of oil. I really like how this looks, and I think the grain really pops nicely. All that's really left now is to sand and oil the tabletops. I'm just working through the regular progression of papers. I think it was 120, 180, 240, 320, something like that. I'm using Mirka Abernet paper. I love that stuff. It doesn't clog, seems to last forever, and it does a really nice job. We'll give it a little courtesy rub with a tack cloth, and then we will apply some finish. Then we just buff it off, and it's done. Well, almost done. I actually rubbed the entire table down with a product called True Oil. True Oil is usually used for finishing gun stocks, but it is a beautiful hard oil that you can apply on pretty much anything. I like that it's durable, but not too glossy. Okay, so here's our table completed. You can see the hardware's on there, the True Oil's on the top. It's got a bit of a gloss. You can knock that back with a bit of steel wool. There's the True Oil. And here's that pretty little drawer. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this build, please give us a like. And if you really enjoyed this build, consider subscribing.